everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Startup Happy Hour. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and I'm here today with our guest, Rachel He, product designer at Spotify. I'm super excited to have her on. She is the first product designer that I've had on the podcast, so really excited to talk to her all about what being a product designer actually entails. And also super excited that she's at Spotify and we get to hear from somebody from behind the scenes. You all obviously already know what Spotify is, but we'll get to hear some behind the scenes information on Spotify, maybe hear about what they're working on next and what you can expect to see in the future. So without further ado, hey Rachel, welcome.
Yeah, hey Diana. Really nice to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for giving us your time. So I generally start off by asking the guest about their company. Tell us what the company is. Obviously, everybody knows what Spotify is, so we don't need much of an intro there. But I would love to hear about the team that you work on, the product design team at Spotify, and specifically what sorts of products you're working on or what type of work you're doing there.
Yeah, totally. I guess without introducing Spotify too much, I work on a team called the Podcaster Mission. We focus on things that are related to podcasters and any service that they might see. That includes Spotify for podcasters, which is how you get your analytics when you're a podcaster that has a podcast on Spotify. And it also includes a product called Anchor, which is creation and distribution of podcasts, which was acquired, I want to say, a year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. And so it's a really interesting team. We get to work kind of like a startup within a big company environment, which is really fun. And I think it's really interesting working for creators as well. It's definitely something that I haven't done before this particular job. I've mostly worked on like consumer stuff. So I'm learning a lot.
That's awesome. So this is all super fascinating and exciting things for me because I actually use Anchor to record my podcast and to distribute it out to the channels. And my podcast is on Spotify as well. So I'd love to hear more about the sorts of, so do you work on designing like the interface of Anchor when people go on to use it and Spotify analytics? Like, can you get into more of the details of what are the specific things that you personally work on as a product designer?
Right. So I, as a product designer at Spotify, I think the goal is that you're a relatively multidisciplinary person, but focus mostly on interfaces and experiences. And so I really work on, for example, different features that might launch in the Spotify app, or we recently underwent a rebrand in Anchor where we kind of implemented a new brand designed by a small agency here in New York. And so I helped implement that from the product side, as opposed to like the marketing assets and kind of ad campaigns. I kind of brought the brand to life, colors and all, in the app.
Yeah, I noticed that new rebrand in Anchor recently, actually, because I'm on it all the time for, to upload the podcast and things like that. And I think it looks really nice. I really do like it. So you had mentioned that working now with creators in your podcast role is a little different from previous roles that you've had. I just want to call out so this is your first full-time gig, but you've worked at some pretty big names in the past when you were interning and things like that. You were at Airbnb, Peloton, DoorDash. Can you talk more about what your experiences in those companies were, also as a product designer, and maybe how they were similar or different to what you're doing now?
Totally. Yeah. I think DoorDash was my first, like, I guess, quote unquote, real tech internship, as I call it. It was a much smaller company than what is today. When I interned there, I think we were several hundred people, maybe like 400 to 700 people, something like that. That's a big range. I'm sorry. Definitely closer to 400 if I recall correctly. But there were, I think, 10 designers, including me and another intern. We worked very much as a unit, as opposed to, I think some bigger companies tend to distribute their designers across multiple teams and multiple functions, and they kind of work in a more isolated function and then come together like every week. It was more as at DoorDash, it was like the design was this kind of like squad that sat together and worked on projects very much in tandem. I think every other company I've worked at has been a little bit more of the distributed model. We called it like a studio model, where the designers would be their own studio, quote unquote. And so I think that's one of the biggest differences, honestly, between DoorDash and all of the other places I've worked. I think let me think about this. Sorry. Differences. I guess like DoorDash was also very high growth at the time. We, I think, raised 2 rounds while I was there in one summer. That was really just a very like intense and exciting time, I guess, in the company. I think at Peloton was much more mature and had kind of a more regimented structure. And then Airbnb was, I think, late stage, definitely like very mature, but not necessarily corporate yet, or didn't have this corporate energy yet. And so they were all a little bit different, but operated relatively similarly. I think my role or the expectations in my job description hasn't changed too much in the last few years, I think, which is I'm grateful for. But I think the product areas are definitely very interesting and unique. I think like, DoorDash being food delivery, Peloton being a little bit more fitness, but also you're working with like the physical products like the bike, and then Airbnb being travel. You have this like entire physical experience married to a digital experience. And I think that's true of Spotify in its own unique way, in that you are kind of interacting with Spotify and the real world at the same time. Hopefully. Yeah. And then finally like Anchor / podcasting being this whole different beast of, how do we serve creators as opposed to consumers trying to buy something. That's definitely a very different kind of interaction and set of, I guess, experiences.
Yeah, for sure. So when you think about how do you serve creators for the podcast, how is that different from the thinking when you're really just trying to serve a bunch of consumers?
I think the biggest thing is that there's a lot of personal investment in whatever is being generated in the app. I think when you're ordering, let's say like a few tacos on DoorDash, I think you're focused on the food, but when you're a podcast creator on Anchor, you're really invested in this almost like child that you have, right? Like it's your baby. It's something that you're crafting yourself, and you have a lot of personal investment in it. You're hoping that it ideally represents you correctly. You're hoping that it comes out good, right? Like the quality is decent and digestible. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting like sets of emotions, I guess, is the thing that intrigues me most. How you cope with like the excitement of starting out versus cresting into like something that you realize how much work it's going to be, and then you go through all of the different steps and start realizing like the different challenges, and ultimately like launching that product or releasing that podcast is very like a very pivotal or not pivotal, like central moment in the flow. Yeah, I think, I haven't really like been a podcaster myself, but I think from observing, there's definitely this interesting mix of like moments that is very unique from consumer products.
Yeah, for sure. And just like in the length of time that you're interacting with the product, right? For DoorDash, your length of time, your interaction is maybe spans an hour from the time you open the app to search for a restaurant, to order something, and then for it to arrive at your place. And then you're done with DoorDash until the next time you want to order tacos or ramen or whatever you want to order, right? Whereas with
Right.
Anchor, it's like I might log on to Anchor 10 times in a day if I'm having a big day, or if I'm
Totally.
releasing a new episode or something. And so I'm constantly interacting with it. And so I do think that interaction is almost like more important. I think it's just hard to compare. It's like comparing apples to
Yeah.
oranges, but in a sense, just because of the length of time that a user is spending on the product, I would say that the design and the UX and all of that is almost more important in a sense. So I totally get that. So going even farther back, you were actually a computer science major in college, and then you had a minor in visual art. And so now you're a product designer. So you're actually a self-taught product designer. So talk more about, I guess, first of all, what made you decide to major in computer science, which doesn't seem like you're really using anymore. And then secondly, how did you teach yourself product design?
Yeah. Interesting story, I guess, in that I came about product design a little bit haphazardly, but I tried to be as intentional as possible about the computer science major, honestly. I, as a young high school student, thought that I was getting into something very different than what it actually was. I was interested in video games and essentially like doing little flash animations and maybe like I don't know, just little design related interactions. Frankly, in retrospect, I thought that I was getting into something that I could start making video games or something like that. That was kind of the impetus behind that decision. And then I got to college and realized that wasn't the case, but was still very happy to be learning a lot of different, programming languages and kind of like skills related to computer science. I think from the get-go, I was still pretty interested in a creative field. I did more like classical like painting and sculpture. I did kind of like a stint where I was doing a lot of Western art in high school because I grew up in Texas and there was this big like culture of Western art around rodeos and county state fairs and that kind of thing. And so there was some sense of I want to marry like visual skills with something more tactical, I guess, is what I was thinking. And my freshman year, I was looking for, any job that paid the rent. I think I literally like applied to be a secretary at a law office even. Thankfully didn't go down that route. But
Great choice.
yeah, I know. I ended up getting an offer from this really small seed stage startup. It was 11 people, including me. I was the only designer. I worked directly with the CEO and CTO. I was effectively like their brand and marketing designer. But after seeing that I had a computer science degree or major in training, they were like, "Hey, do you wanna help build out our website? Do you wanna help design our product?" And it kind of evolved from there into me designing like interfaces for them. I wouldn't even call it product design. I was doing everything very informally. I was using all the wrong software. I was, employing very informal techniques and just kind of like haphazardly throwing rectangles on a screen based off of what, people around me were telling me they wanted to see. And I think I went back to school the next fall and was just like, I want to figure out how to do this for real. I want to understand a little bit better what it is like to do this professionally. And so I, took a bunch of my free time just trying to read as much as I could, practice as much as I could. And I ended up joining this small, like, student-run development agency where we took on a bunch of different clients, and that was incredible practice, and really helped me build out essentially like the crucial thing that every designer applies with, my portfolio. And so I think it was very like I took a very learn on the job approach, I will say. I think I took one total class on like product slash UX design in college, and it was my senior year, just because I wanted to figure out, what would it be like to be formally trained in this to some degree. But other than that, it was like entirely, scraping the internet and doing effective Googling on product design, I think.
Nice. It's very impressive. And just to clear up for people who maybe aren't really familiar with what product design actually is, I think, there's all these different types of design: graphic design, web design, product design. Can you just maybe give a definition of product design, or talk about how product design is different from other types of design?
Oh, yeah. I actually always dread this question. It's definitely different depending on who you ask. No. It's totally fine. I think it's like, it's such a new, I guess, position. It's a very new set line of work. And I think people argue all day about what product design really is. I think when you scrape it down to the fundamentals, you're designing digital experiences or products, which is where the word product comes from, and that's kind of your responsibility is to deliver some set of experiences and visions around how it will look and feel. I think a lot of people expect product designers to do a little bit of everything. Oftentimes, in especially in startup positions, I think like, that really small seed stage startup internship that I was talking about, like I was expected to do pretty much all forms of design, and that I started to specialize as I kind of came into bigger companies with more specialized roles. But I don't know, I've heard product designers say like the future of product design is you're a PM who just knows how to design. I've heard people who say like product designers should all know how to code, they should be engineers who know how to design. But I think it is what you make of it, I guess. You really just have to know how to like craft a good experience. That's, I think, the fundamental part of the job. Yeah, it's definitely a tough question, I guess, like in that I would say like a lot of product designers I talk to go back and forth and argue about it. It's quite hilarious to see sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. It kind of reminds me of product management, because that's also sort of like an ambiguous role, right? Like there's like product managers that are more techie, and then there's product managers that are more on the business side. It seems like there's a whole spectrum of what a product manager actually is, and product design sort of sounds like that too. But it definitely sounds like you need to have some knowledge in design and then some knowledge in UX. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. I think a common misconception is that you need to be good at drawing or like illustration to be good at product design. I hear that a lot. And I'm like, honestly, I've done visual arts for like so many years, and it sometimes translates, but I don't think I really would say it's a requirement. I think you're right. You have to kind of know some design and then some like experiential understanding of how experiences are made. But yeah, I totally agree with the PM sentiment too, because like I remember the head of product at DoorDash once said in a meeting, like, people always ask me what the product team does, and sometimes I just don't have an answer, and that's kind of how I feel about product design sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. So if you could go back and give yourself advice, or give somebody who's in college right now advice on how to become a product designer at Spotify or a company like Spotify in the future, what would your number one piece of advice for them be?
I would say get practice. I think it's something that as you familiarize yourself with like the craft and kind of the general process, you just get better and better over time. I think like it shows when I talk to like a manager that's a lot more senior than me, or a designer who has just like more years experience or more like breadth of experience than me. They'll say like, oh, this is something that, you know, there's no way you could have known this except for having spent more time on it. And so I think that's true, like really for students especially, like just spend time on it.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of like one of the big topics of debate with higher education these days, right? Is do you need it or not? Or is it more important to just go out and get the practical skills? Or do you need to sit in a class and learn the theoretical side of it, which I feel like is a lot of what college teaches you. And so
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it makes sense. I think for any industry, truly any industry, but especially for something like product design, it does really help to go out and get that practical experience and to see what you're really getting yourself into and what are the skills that you actually need to develop in order to have a career in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
sorry. Go for it.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I think, I mean, I learned a lot of soft skills, honestly, on the job, and that improved my ability to execute on design, strangely enough. I'm not sure what it is about the job, but I think, like, a lot of it is interacting with other people. It's really tough to design just by yourself, and so I think that was really helpful. But I also will disclaim that in the spectrum of people, I'm not very like pro school or very attached to traditional academia. So I think, you know, I might be being a little bit facetious here.
That seems to be a common theme amongst the guests I have on this podcast. So it might just be a startup or a tech thing, is we're more about the practical skills than the academia.
Maybe.
Otherwise we'd be in university teaching. We'd be university professors or something, right? If we were more into
Right.
academia.
Right.
All right. So I know that aside from your full-time job, you have multiple passion projects. And so one of them is green design. And then another one that you're working on is climate designers. And that's something that you're super passionate about, is taking care of our environment and climate change and climate justice, as you call it. We'll dive into that in a second. But why don't you just talk about those projects and talk about sort of like what made you so interested in climate, and like what is the whole thing around climate that we should all know?
Right. I think, how do I introduce this? I guess I have always been, you know, a lover of the earth to some degree. I definitely had a short stint of like maybe in middle school years, like thought I would be a marine biologist and would save the ocean animals or something like that. But I think I definitely didn't merge any sort of like climate and tech in my brain until very late in college. I think I was a senior when I first interacted with some sort of like climate tech or climate like and digital products kind of interaction. I had this like I found this research group essentially at NYU that was conducting research around solar powered servers, and I was like, this is absolutely the coolest thing. Like you know, I learned so much about how like essentially the environmental cost of the internet and how much it takes to, you know, keep everything on all the time. And I think we had a solar powered server built and set up in an NYU building. It took in energy, and we had a website running on it, and just ran a bunch of different tests as like what happens when you put a video on it, and what quality of video like how does the quality of the video impact essentially the like load on the server and all these things. And I think that transformed into, I guess, the project that you're talking about, the green design project, which is effectively like a set of guidelines and like resources for building a more resilient and sustainable internet, different techniques that you can employ beyond just shifting to renewables to lighten the load on what normally is a server running on dirty energy like coal. And that's that was my first I guess like interaction with climate and design and climate tech and that kind of stuff. Shortly after I started working with this research group, I found the group called Climate Designers. They had very recently launched, or they had very recently like started doing meetups in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I, being in New York, was like, darn it, like I'm so far away. How do I interact with all these cool people? I just want to, like meet more people who are doing the thing that I'm interested in. And luckily enough, I happened to have a trip to SF that like coincided with their meetup, and I went there and was like, hey, do you guys would you guys ever consider coming to New York? Would you guys ever consider opening some sort of like branch in New York? And they said, yeah, like we've thought about it a lot, but we just haven't had anyone like volunteer to do it. And so I volunteered to do it, and we originally held meetups like every month. It was just a bunch of different I think the focus is more on designers who care about the climate or care about the environment, as opposed to environmentalists who are interested in design. And so I think the purpose of the group is really just like, we have this skill set. It's not traditionally linked to climate science or anything, but how can we employ it to essentially like fight for the planet?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear your answer to that if you've got one. One of the themes of this season of the podcast is sort of like, how do we use the tech that we have, or the jobs that we have in tech, to shape the future? And I think there's so much potential in what you just described for designers, connecting two things that you wouldn't necessarily put together, design and climate. Like, you wouldn't really automatically see the link there, but like you said, there's really something there that designers can do to help the climate. And so talk more about like, what is that solution, and what can designers do for the climate for the next, 5, 10, even 20 years? And where do you envision us being with the climate and with all the energy that we use up with the internet and things like that? And moving forward, we've got other sorts of energy suckers beyond just the internet as we know it now. There's Bitcoin mining, and that obviously sucks up a lot of energy too. So that's getting into another topic. But what can designers do? And then where do you envision our world being in the next 10 years?
Oh, yeah. Great questions. I mean, I think the first thing is that Climate Designers as a group is like all sorts of designers. So we have some more like physical material interactions going on, like fashion designers who are using more sustainable materials, and print designers who are using like recycled kind of like materials for like paper. But I think in the digital realm, the main thing is that, I mean, we run essentially every internet process on a server, and that server takes up energy. I think a large majority of that is dirty energy, and unfortunately is very costly, and I think the biggest tragedy of it all is frankly that the cloud is like this kind of poorly marketed term, in that I think when someone thinks of the cloud, they think, it's in the air, it's this abstract thing that doesn't have any physical consequences, when in reality it actually does have a huge environmental, I guess, footprint. And so I think the jobs for someone like me in this scenario are like, how do we transition away from obsessing about like all these high tech interactions that require a lot of energy, or make them more efficient when we're designing them, and just kind of like reducing the weight of everything we're building. I think the other part is advocacy, trying to advocate for renewable servers. I think a lot of the big tech companies like Google, Apple, run on a large amount of renewables, which is like a really great change. And I think it's promising for, like you said, like the next 10 years. What does that look like? I think ideally what that looks like is we're transitioning the internet at large to renewables in a way that is both rapid and effective. I think a lot of people have different opinions on this. I know like a lot of energy scientists say like, oh, well, we took so long to transition out of the industrial era. We still have, marks from that. And so there's no way that we can achieve, 100% renewables by whatever year, like within our generation, even. And so I think there's a lot of debate on the execution of things. I think the biggest thing is that we attempt to A, transition to renewables, and B, what we can't transition, we essentially alleviate or lighten the load in terms of like the burden it has on the environment. That's generally how I see it.
Got it. So tons of potential there, and I think we all know what's going to happen if we don't pay attention to this stuff. There's, we've all seen. Well, I think we're all caught up on that enough to know. But I also want to pose the same question to you on the Spotify/Anchor front with content creators. There's a lot of, I guess, the big issue right now with content creators is just being able to own their own content. So whether you're a musician with music streaming on Spotify, or if you're a podcaster, or whatever the case is, especially for musicians though, is all about owning your own music and copyright things and all of that stuff. So talk about like, where do you see this space moving in the next 10 years with how much ownership content creators will have over their own music, podcasts, whatever it is they're creating? And I don't know if this is something that you guys talk about at Spotify or Anchor, or if there's chatter or plans to do anything, but if you can share a little bit more of that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Oh man. I think there's a lot to unpack in the music realm, especially in terms of Spotify. I don't think on the podcasting teams we try to like stay a little bit further away from that or separate because of just the complicated politics and legal issues and just kind of like where that is. I think in terms of podcasting, it's really interesting with the rise of products like Clubhouse, where it's like shared audio or social audio. I think a lot of, I remember Facebook or I guess Instagram specifically launched the like video chat rooms and that kind of thing. But we also have stuff like FaceTime and stuff like Discord, where there's a lot of like more social audio interactions that are fleeting. It's really interesting to imagine like treating that as podcasts, or treating kind of like the fleeting moments of a video call as a podcast. Whereas the traditional form of podcasting is I guess a little bit closer to radio or almost like radio journalism. But podcasting is very new. I think there are no rules set around it. It's very like, that's what's so exciting about it, is that that nobody can really tell you that you're doing it wrong, because it's such a new media format that is constantly changing and people are constantly doing it differently. Everybody has their own opinions on it. And all of them to a certain extent are correct. So that's kind of my attitude towards like the content creation, like podcasting sphere. Ownership of content is really tough because there's the idea of like remixing. What happens when you remix a podcast or take a clip of someone else's podcast and splice it into your own. We also launched a kind of feature called Music and Talk podcasts on Anchor, which you might have seen. You essentially can splice like Spotify songs into your podcast, and it's like connected within Spotify, only available on Spotify. And that's super interesting because it's like, well, the song isn't yours. Under what circumstances does a podcast with a song become, you know, your own podcast or the artist's podcast, you know, like if I had a episode, for example, that has like all Beyonce songs or something like that, does it become Beyonce's album, or is it actually something that I own and that I, you know, like remixed into something that I have, I guess, legal rights over? There's an interesting, like, I guess, realm to discover in terms of like the mixing of music and podcasting, or music and talk formats. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really, really like gone in head first on the like music legal section. Honestly, I probably should do my research. But it's kind of ever evolving on the podcasting side for sure. Which is great.
Yeah, definitely. Lots to look forward to there. So, started to wrap up this conversation about product design. What is the coolest project that you've worked on as a product designer, whether that's at Spotify/Anchor or at any point in your career?
Oh boy. I want to say that solar powered research project. It wasn't necessarily something that we shipped or anything, but you know, like the team got invited to talk at a conference. We like shared so many different findings. There was like, you know, I think it led to a lot of different conversations about, I guess, like the nature of the internet. I think one really exciting thing is like in my research process, I met someone, a designer that's very passionate about the climate in the UK, who I recently wrote the foreword for his book on sustainable web design, and it's called like Sustainable Web Design. It's about, you know, the nature, the like heavy nature of the internet, and how to kind of like combat that, which is really exciting. I think like in that the project was exciting, but it led to a lot of incredible, I guess, like interactions that I've had in the last few years. Yeah.
Nice, nice. Okay, so sort of on that same topic, I'm going to shift into our next segment. This is called Explain Your Tweet. This is where I dig through your Twitter and pull out some tweets that I found to be interesting or controversial or funny, and I'm going to give you a chance to explain them. So while we're still on this topic of climate, I'm going to go back to, this was from, let's see, June 6th, 2020. You tweeted, which also, by the way, you really like to do Twitter threads, which I'm a big fan of, because I like that they have so much information that you can really learn from them and really get into the head of the person who tweeted that thread. So this is a long thread, but the first tweet in the thread said, "I've been trying to come up with a good way to talk about climate and race. Here are some people in their writings that I've been thinking about." And then you linked a lot of articles in your thread. But basically the whole gist of it is how climate justice and anti-racism are very directly linked. And so this is I've read, you know, headlines about it and stuff, but have never really dove into it. So can you talk a little bit more about how climate and race are linked?
Right. I mean, I think I am by no means an expert on this. There's tons and tons of academic, I guess, research and documentation on this, but I think one of the frustrating things that I was feeling when I sent out that tweet was that I think climate tech, and specifically climate tech bros, I guess, tend to try to separate the issue of climate change from, I guess, the injustices that have happened in terms of, you know, historically, like how we've treated the environment and how we've treated the land on which marginalized communities live. I think, you know, if you dive into that thread, I think I tweet a lot about, you know, how marginalized communities often live closest to big polluters, which leads to all kinds of health conditions and all kinds of, you know, like development of cancer and development of lung conditions and development of, you know, different like heart problems. I think there's a lot to dive into about, I guess, indigenous rights in America and how, you know, like we've taken this land from them and how they were the like some of the original, I guess, champions of Mother Nature and kind of building resilient societies that are regenerative and kind of like are respectful of the planet in a way that's sustainable. And I think the tough thing is like tech really, like a lot of climate tech really tries to like separate themselves from these arguments in a way that it's like, we can solve this with numbers and we can solve this with, you know, just like pure, I guess, science in a way. But there's a lot of like tough history and legislation to unpack there, I think is really the backstory there.
Yeah, for sure. And for people interested in this topic, you can just Google it or go to Rachel's Twitter and click through the thread. She linked a bunch of articles that are really solid. She's done the research for you already. Okay, so next tweet. This is from June 29th, 2020. Did a lot of tweeting back in June, beginning of
Apparently.
COVID. Not much to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is another thread, so I won't read the whole thing, but the first tweet says, I want to know why computer science programs have no tech ethics course requirements when the industry promises students that they have the power to change the world. And then it kind of goes on.
Oh my goodness, yes.
How the hell are you qualified to build a social media platform or a search engine without learning basic concepts of sociology, politics, participatory journalism, ethical dissemination of information, etc.? Was this when The Social Dilemma came out, or am I not matching up the timeline correctly?
I don't know. Probably not. This was a very controversial tweet, honestly. I got a lot of interesting, I guess, I wouldn't call it hate mail, but controversy mail, maybe, about this. I think there are ethics, like tech ethics courses. Sometimes they are required in certain programs. Oftentimes they aren't. I wasn't required to take a tech ethics course. I think there's also, you know, a glorification, the glorifying of, I guess like we talked about this, like not really studying something, but just kind of like going out into the world and kind of like trying to kind of like figure it out by yourself. I think like I said, like we said, that is a really good approach when it comes to tech sometimes, but oftentimes it can lead to, you know, a bunch of 21-year-olds kind of bumbling about and making mistakes, and sometimes that's tough because like if you work at, you know, big companies with a lot of users, those mistakes can have pretty serious consequences, and so I think you know, it's kind of a very I guess tough like line of thought in that I am very like unsure what the right approach is. Like, do you require everyone to take a tech ethics course? Does that mean that, you know, everybody will learn everything? Like, probably not. I've definitely slept through lectures and haven't paid attention to classes, and so I don't necessarily think that's the solution. But I think there is a interesting, I guess, dynamic and almost like hypocrisy there, where I guess a young computer science student can essentially make waves in the industry without having any sort of, I guess, like moral compass attached to it. Not saying that we have had like people, you know, recklessly run through tech and kind of make waves like that, but there's definitely potential.
Well, I mean, we certainly have too, right?
Yeah.
I was gonna ask too. Was there, when you tweeted this, was there a specific sort of like event that happened or specific thing you were thinking of, or can you think of any specific examples of sort of like what could happen when there is a lot of skill and talent in the tech industry without a lot of ethics?
Yeah, I remember I think I had talked to a friend at Facebook about like the kind of like legal policies, that like scandal that broke over the summer about their kind of like political approach to politics and kind of stuff like that. I mean, I think I can't remember if this was at the same time, but like there have been there was like a incident at Robinhood where you know, really unfortunately, like a young kid like took his life because he misinterpreted the product. And I think, when you have, I guess, like the consequences of our product decisions can lead to death. That's like a terrifying idea, especially as someone who, like, I only recently, got a 401k and understood what that meant. I barely like know what it means to be, a functioning person in society. And yet, like, people my age are making decisions around that ultimately lead to someone's like suffering or lack of suffering feels very scary. And so I think that's kind of what I was thinking at the time. Definitely some heavy stuff that led to a lot of like frustrated tweeting, I think, late at night.
For sure. I can relate to that 100%. I don't know if this is, maybe something that crossed your mind when you were tweeting this, but something that just came up for me as you were saying that is another big thing that's not really talked about in the tech industry that I think should be is mental health. And I almost feel like, I don't know if this is, something that needs to be taught in starting in college before people get out into the field. But I think just the total, I don't know if I want to say lack of awareness of mental health or lack of respect, or just how it's still a taboo topic in a lot of communities, I think is very troubling. And especially having gone through what we all just went through with 2020, I think mental health was something that almost everybody dealt with to some degree. And I think ignoring this topic or, keeping it taboo is just not the way to go.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I am really lucky to work at, what is essentially a Scandinavian company. Like, our HQ is based in Stockholm, which means we have lovely mental health resources. But that's not something that I've encountered at every tech company. It was very strange almost to like come into a company where people were regularly talking about mental health and talking about, what effectively we treat mental health equal to physical health almost, in that, you're welcome to take as much time off because of both mental and physical health problems. And they're, treated with the same gravity. But I mean, there's like within a company, there's mental health, like the idea of respecting a employee's mental health, and not pretending like just because we're a bunch of engineers or product designers that we can treat everything very like scientifically or very, pragmatically. And then there's also the idea of user mental health, where it's like, the new screen time feature, or I guess not new screen time feature, but the screen time feature on iPhones like encourages you to step away, and there are ever more, I guess, like products that try to allow you to step away from your phone, but there are many others that don't. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely not something that I've encountered a lot in tech, just like a thoughtfulness around mental health, unless you are a healthcare startup or a mental health startup, or in my case, a very European, very mental health forward company. But I agree, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge plug for Spotify, though. I actually don't think I was aware of that they're a Stockholm-based company. But hopefully in the next 10 years, we'll see, that how you guys are treated at Spotify becomes the norm of how tech companies treat their employees in the States. All right, so Rachel, tell us a little bit more about who you are outside of work and all the stuff that you do. We've gotten to know you quite a bit already. You really care about the environment. You really care about, just fairness, justice, being a good person, ethics, things like that, which is all good things. But tell us about like any other hobbies you have or what you like to do in your free time, any random fun facts about you.
Yeah, I think, being a good person is definitely one of my interests. But I really love, I really struggle saying this. I really love food, which I think can sound superficial to some people, but I really love like the way that food brings people together. I really, I think as an Asian American, as a child of Asian immigrants, food is a very central thing to my interpersonal interactions. So I really love spending time around that. Anything climate related and food related is like a huge plus to me. I love like, I currently volunteer with a community supported agriculture kind of thing. It's called a CSA. They have a farm somewhere upstate New York, and different people essentially buy shares of it. And so I've been developing recipes for them and creating content for them. What else? I love like outdoorsy stuff. I love like hiking, biking. This past summer, I picked up surfing, and in the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of like rock climbing. So lots of like physical, nature-y stuff. What else? What else am I interested in? I mean, any like thing to do with like brain ticklers, like puzzles and reading and that kind of stuff is all on the table, I guess. And I think like something that I don't really do now too much, but I definitely like used to do, especially like as a continuation from my work in high school, is like doodling and sketching and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I saw you had a painting page on your website, which is pretty cool. And I guess that comes from your visual arts background, right?
Yeah. Those are definitely archaic artifacts, but definitely an interest of mine.
I have zero visual arts talent whatsoever. So any sort of thing, probably whatever you drew back in, second grade is better than what I can do now. So I'm very impressed by all of it. Also very impressed by just how well-rounded you are and how you've got a comp sci major. You can do that stuff, your design, content creation, like all this sort of thing. Super impressive. And I can't wait to see what you end up doing with all of that. I think it's going to be really great. And just to wrap up here, I've got two quick, fun little questions for you. The first one, since you said you love to eat, is if you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would that be?
Ooh, probably some sort of vegetable, like broccoli or bok choy or something like that. I would probably eat for the rest of my life. Yeah, I feel like they're so versatile. You can like season them with anything. You can chop them up in different ways, and like, I don't know. Also, I just feel better when I have kind of like a good serving of vegetables in me, which I don't know. Maybe like first grade me would have disagreed, but.
No, for sure. I think you definitely have to take into consideration what is not going to make you feel like shit if you have to eat it every day for the rest of your life. Because you need assuming you want to live till you're, 70 or 80 or however long people live till.
Right. I mean, I'm sure I'd love to also eat creme brulee every day, but I probably wouldn't be able to get anything done.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Next question. If you could have any superpower, what superpower would you have?
I like the idea of like flying or speed or some sort of like thing that allows me to move places quickly. That's always been appealing to me.
Yeah, and you get that adrenaline rush too, right? Because if you just want to move, you could just teleport, but then you miss the adrenaline rush of like zooming through the air.
Right. And I think, I don't know, it's always so cool in the movies. Love like thinking about, I think everybody has like dreams about them flying or something like that. And it's like that kind of stuff is really cool.
For sure. All right. Well, thanks so much, Rachel, for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation. We hit on so many different things that I wasn't even expecting to talk about. So thank you so much for that. Before you go, just tell people where they can find you if they want to reach out to you personally, if they want to follow your very enlightening Twitter threads, and also where they can learn more about the new Spotify podcasting program and Anchor and things like that.
Yeah, you can follow me. Anything I'm on, it's usually Rachel Y. He, RACHEL, letter Y, and then HE. That's also my website, rachelyhe.com. For Spotify stuff, definitely follow. There's like a Spotify for podcasters. There's Spotify social accounts. Spotify.design is a super great resource. And then anything Anchor related would be like anchor.fm or at Anchor or something like that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much, Rachel. We'll include all that in the show notes so it's easy for people to find. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and we will be back again soon with another episode of Startup Happy Hour.
Awesome. Thanks so much.